A river runs black, not with mud, not with blood, with ink. Survivors of the siege would later say that the Tigris changed color and stayed dark for days. So many books had been thrown into the water that the river itself became a manuscript no one could read. That was February 1258. But those books took 500 years to write. 5 centuries of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, collected from every corner of the known world, translated into a single language, and stored in a single city, one library, 1 week of destruction. This is the story of the place that tried to hold all of human knowledge at once, and what happened when someone decided to erase it. By the end of this, we will understand how one city became the hard drive of civilization. We will see why the greatest collection of knowledge in the medieval world was also the most fragile, and we will learn what the world lost when the ink hit the water. In 762, a caliph named Al-Mansur stood on the banks of the Tigris and decided to build a city from nothing. He had just consolidated power over a new dynasty, the Abbasids, and he needed a capital that was entirely his own. Damascus belonged to his predecessors. Mecca and Medina were sacred, not administrative. He needed a blank page, and he found it at the junction of the Tigris and the Sarat Canal, 30 kilometers north of the ruins of Ctesiphon, the old Sasanian capital that had once ruled the same region under a different name. The city he designed was unlike anything the world had seen. It was perfectly circular, 2.5 kilometers across, 3 concentric walls, 4 gates, each named after the direction it faced: Kufa, Basra, Khorasan, Damascus. At the center, the caliph's palace, crowned by a green dome 48 meters high. He called it Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace. History would call it Baghdad. What makes this founding remarkable is not the architecture, it is the team. Al-Mansur hired 2 designers, Nobakat, a Zoroastrian astronomer, and Mashallah, a Jewish astrologer from Khorasan, a Muslim caliph, a Zoroastrian, and a Jew building a city together. They chose the founding date, July 30, 762, because the stars were aligned under Leo, the sign of fire and expansion. Over 100,000 workers arrived from across the empire. The construction took 4 years. Most empires build their capitals to project power. Al-Mansur built his to collect it. Baghdad was not designed as a fortress or a temple. It was designed as a node, a central point where trade routes, languages, and ideas converged. The circular plan was borrowed from Sasanian Persia. The ambition was borrowed from no one. Within a generation, Baghdad exploded. Merchants arrived from China, India, East Africa, and the Mediterranean. The Tigris carried cargo ships loaded with silk, spices, and paper. The 4 roads leading from the 4 gates became arteries of a global economy. By the 9th century, the population had crossed 1 million. Baghdad was almost certainly the largest city on earth. The city was not just large, it was literate. Baghdad had public hospitals, called Bimaristans, that treated patients regardless of faith or ability to pay. It had pharmacies that required government licenses. It had bookshops, not 1 or 2, but entire streets of them, reportedly selling thousands of titles per day. The city even had a postal system inherited from the Sasanian model, which moved mail across the caliphate at speeds that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. Night watchmen patrolled the streets, market inspectors checked weights and measures, a police force kept order from headquarters inside the caliph's palace. This was not a medieval backwater with a famous library attached to it. This was the most functionally advanced city on the planet. But the real engine of Baghdad's power was not trade, it was translation. A young scholar arrives at the palace library before sunrise. The corridors are cool. Oil lamps flicker along stone walls lined with shelves. He sits before a Greek manuscript, Galen's Anatomy, and begins to translate it into Arabic, word by word, line by line. He has been doing this for 3 years. For each completed book, the caliph pays him its weight in gold. He does not think of himself as making history. He thinks of himself as doing a job. But the job will reshape the world. The translation movement began under al-Mansur, but accelerated dramatically under his grandson, Harun al-Rashid, and reached its peak under al-Rashid's son, al-Mamun. Al-Mamun transformed a royal book collection into something far more ambitious, a working academy called Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. Here, scholars did not simply copy old texts. They translated Aristotle from Greek. They translated Brahmagupta from Sanskrit. They translated Galen, Ptolemy, Euclid, and Hippocrates from Syriac and Greek into Arabic. They drew from Persian administrative texts and Indian mathematical treatises. The working languages were Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Arabic. The entry requirement was fluency in at least 2. The most productive translator was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Christian physician from the Arab tribe of Ibad. He translated over 260 works and authored more than 100 of his own. He was 17 when he started. The system did not care about your faith. It cared about your output. The House of Wisdom was not a charity. It was an investment. The Abbasid caliphs funded translation for the same reason modern governments fund research, because knowledge is a strategic resource. The caliph who controls the library controls what the empire knows, and what the empire knows determines what it can build. But the House of Wisdom was more than a translation bureau. It was a machine that produced original thinkers, scholars who did not merely preserve old knowledge, but extended it into territory no one had mapped. A mathematician from Khwarezm, a region near the Aral Sea, worked at the house under al-Mamun's patronage. His name was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. Around 820, he wrote a book with a title that would change the world. It was called the Compendious Book on Calculation by Completion and Balancing. The Arabic title contained the word Algebra. Europe would later borrow that word and call it Algebra. When his other works were translated into Latin in the 12th century, European scholars Latinized his name as algorithmi. That word became algorithm. Every line of code running on every computer on Earth carries the echo of a 9th century scholar working in a Baghdad library. Al-Khwarizmi also wrote a treatise on the Hindu numeral system, the digits 0 through 9 that we use every day. Before his work reached Europe, Western mathematicians were still using Roman numerals. Try dividing MCML XX4 Thi by XL Sever Thi. Now try dividing 1974 by 47. That difference, the difference between clumsiness and clarity, came through Baghdad. A physician born in Bukhara, Ibn Sina, known to Europe as Avicenna, wrote a medical encyclopedia so comprehensive that it became the standard. European universities used it as a primary textbook for 600 years. His canon of medicine classified diseases, described contagion mechanisms, and organized the human body with the same systematic logic that the Abbasids used to organize their empire. The empire that built roads and relay stations also built a map of the human body. The method was the same, only the territory changed. An astronomer and poet from Nishapur, Omar Khayyam, recalculated the length of the solar year in 1079. His Jalali calendar was accurate to within 6.5 seconds per year. The Gregorian calendar, introduced 500 years later, is accurate to 27 seconds. The man best known in the West for his poetry about wine and roses was, in his own time, one of the most precise astronomers alive. And it was not just individuals. In 828, Al-Mamun ordered the construction of the first astronomical observatory in the Islamic world, right here in Baghdad. Teams of scholars measured the movements of the sun, moon, and planets and compiled the results into verified astronomical tables. This was not solitary genius working in isolation. This was organized, state-funded science, a concept Europe would not adopt for another 8 centuries. These scholars did not appear by accident. They were outputs of a system a system that funded translation, rewarded precision, tolerated religious diversity, and concentrated intellectual talent in a single city. Remove any one of those inputs and the machine stops producing. The individual genius is real, but the infrastructure that enabled it is the story. The system outlives the stone. That was Baghdad's implicit bet. That knowledge, once translated and organized, would endure longer than any palace, and for 5 centuries the bet paid off. And then there was the technology that made all of it possible. In 751, 11 years before Baghdad was even founded, Arab forces clashed with a Chinese army at the Battle of Talas near modern-day Kazakhstan. The Arabs won. Among the prisoners were Chinese papermakers. They were brought to Samarkand, where they revealed the technique. Within decades, paper mills were operating in Baghdad. This was the real revolution. Before paper, books were copied onto parchment, made from animal skin, expensive, slow to produce. Paper was cheap. Paper was fast. Paper turned the House of Wisdom from a library into a factory. Baghdad's bookshops reportedly sold thousands of titles per day. Knowledge was no longer a luxury. It was an industry. But here is where the shadow begins. Some historians push back on the popular image of the House of Wisdom as a grand academy. Yale scholar Dmitry Gutas argues that Beit al-Hikmah was essentially a royal library and translation bureau, not a research university in the modern sense. The Great Translation movement, he contends, was largely driven by private patronage, not by the house itself. The famous scholars often worked independently, funded by wealthy patrons across the city. And the house's activity may have peaked under al-Ma'mun and declined sharply after his death in 833. The romantic image of a single building where all the world's geniuses gathered may be, at least partly, a myth polished by later historians. If you think history is just a list of dates, you've been misled. Here is what actually dictates our fate: systems, and the question of whether those systems are concentrated or distributed. Because whether the House of Wisdom was a single grand academy or a network of libraries, patrons, and scholars scattered across Baghdad, the outcome was the same. The knowledge was produced, the translations were made, the books were written, and all of it, every manuscript, every calculation, every anatomical chart, was concentrated in one city. The system worked, but concentration is a double-edged sword. What can be gathered in one place can be destroyed in one stroke. What does a medieval translation bureau have in common with a modern cloud server? Both centralize information for efficiency, both make knowledge accessible at unprecedented speed, and both share the same fatal vulnerability: a single point of failure. Baghdad was the world's first server farm, and it had no backup. The Abbasid system centralized knowledge the way modern tech centralizes data. The efficiency was extraordinary. The fragility was invisible, until the moment it wasn't. No one builds a backup for a civilization they believe will last forever. But concentration without distribution is a death sentence waiting to be carried out. By the 13th century, the Abbasid Caliphate was a shadow of its former self. The caliphs still sat in Baghdad, but real power had slipped away centuries ago, first Persian Buyid warlords, then to Seljuk Turks. The treasury was drained, the military was hollowed out. The caliphs ruled a city, not an empire, but the libraries were still full, the scholars were still working. The ink was still flowing. Then, from the east, came the Mongols. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, was dispatched westward by his brother Mankeh with one mission: subjugate everything between Mongolia and Egypt. He assembled the largest Mongol army ever raised, over 138,000 men. He crushed the assassins at Alamut. He swept through Persia, and in January 1258 he arrived at the gates of Baghdad. He sent a message to the caliph, al-Mustasim: surrender or be destroyed. The caliph refused. Some historians believe his advisors convinced him the Islamic world would rally to his defense. Others suggest his Grand Vizier, Ibn al-Alqami, may have downplayed the threat due to internal sectarian divisions. Either way, the response was catastrophic miscalculation. Baghdad had roughly 30,000 troops. Hulagu had over 138,000. The siege began on January 29. The Mongols built a palisade around the entire city in a single day. They dug a moat inside the circumvallation. They brought siege engines, catapults, and Chinese pyrotechnics. Burning naphtha launched over the walls. They hauled stones from the Jebel Hamrin Mountains, 3 days' transport away. They built pontoon bridges across the Tigris on both sides of the city to prevent escape by water. The caliph's forces attempted a sortie. The Mongols broke the dikes and flooded the ground behind the caliphal army. Soldiers drowned in the mud of their own land. By February 5th, the Mongols controlled a stretch of the eastern wall. The caliph tried to negotiate. Hulagu refused. On February 10, Baghdad surrendered. What followed was one of the most devastating weeks in human history. The Mongols entered the city on February 13 and did not stop for 7 days. The scholar we met at dawn, the one translating Galen by lamplight, his world ended in those 7 days. The shelves he had lined with manuscripts were emptied. The oil lamps were smashed. The corridors where his footsteps once echoed were filled with soldiers who could not read a single word of what they were destroying. The books were ripped apart. Some were burned, some were looted, and thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, were thrown into the Tigris. Survivors said the water ran black with ink and red with blood. One account claims so many books were thrown into the river that they formed a bridge strong enough to support a man on horseback. Whether that detail is literal or metaphorical, the scale of loss is not in dispute. 500 years of accumulated knowledge, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, poetry, was destroyed in a single week. The death toll is staggering and uncertain. The lowest estimates say 90,000 people were killed. The highest say 1 million. The Caliph al-Mustasim was wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, the Mongol method of executing royalty without spilling noble blood onto the earth. His family was killed alongside him. The Mongols did not destroy Baghdad because they hated knowledge. They destroyed it because the Caliph refused to surrender. The destruction was not ideological, it was procedural. That distinction does not make it less devastating, it makes it more. A civilization's entire intellectual heritage, erased not by a philosophy of ignorance, but by a chain of political miscalculations. Baghdad, after the sack, was unrecognizable. The irrigation canals that had sustained the surrounding farmland for centuries were systematically destroyed. Without irrigation, the fertile land around Baghdad turned to dust. The population collapsed from over 1 million to a fraction of that number. The city that had been the largest in the world became a provincial backwater. It would remain so for centuries. The psychological impact across the Islamic world was immense. The caliphate, a position that had existed since shortly after the Prophet Muhammad was gone, the spiritual and political center of gravity shifted permanently. Cairo rose, Damascus endured. But Baghdad, the city of peace, fell silent. But the knowledge did not die completely. Before the Mongols arrived, copies of many translated works had already traveled beyond Baghdad. Scholars in Cairo, Damascus, and Cordoba possessed their own copies of Al-Khwarizmi, Ibn Sina, and the Greek translations. In the 12th century, a full 100 years before the fall of Baghdad, the city of Toledo in Spain became the center of a second great translation movement. This time, Arab and Jewish scholars translated the Arabic texts into Latin. Through Toledo, the knowledge that Baghdad had gathered from Greece, Persia, and India entered medieval Europe. Aristotle returned to the West, not in Greek, but through Arabic. The medical teachings of Ibn Sina reached European universities. Al-Khwarizmi's Algebra and the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, the numbers we use today, arrived through the same channel. Without the Baghdad to Toledo pipeline, the European Renaissance would have lacked its raw material. The system outlives the stone. Baghdad burned. But the translations survived, scattered, copied, carried by scholars who fled, or by books that had already traveled. The knowledge did not die with the city. It had already seeded itself across 3 continents. Centralization creates brilliance. Distribution creates survival. Baghdad achieved the first but failed at the second. The knowledge survived not because the system protected it, but because the system had leaked. The copies that reached Toledo and Cairo were not part of any backup plan. They were side effects of trade, curiosity, and migration. The most important preservation strategy in history was accidental. We build libraries and call them permanent. We archive data and call it safe. We gather the world's knowledge in server farms and cloud networks and assume it will outlast us. But Baghdad gathered the world's knowledge too, in a round city with 3 walls and 4 gates and a green dome at the center. And it took 1 army, 1 refusal, and 1 week to turn 5 centuries of scholarship into a river of ink. The parallel is not comfortable. Today, a handful of data centers hold the majority of the world's digital information. A single cyber attack, a single geopolitical miscalculation, a single infrastructure failure, and centuries of accumulated knowledge face the same risk that Baghdad faced in 1258. We have bigger servers. We do not necessarily have better strategies. The system outlives the stone, but only if we let it travel. Only if we copy it, scatter it, send it in directions we cannot predict. The books that saved the Renaissance were not the ones locked in Baghdad's vaults. They were the ones that had already left. This is Strata. If there's one lesson Baghdad still teaches, we'd like to hear which one stayed with you. Tell us in the comments. We'll see you in the next era.